Hello. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the first seminar of this academic year seminar series organized by the Climate Change and Law Laboratory of Kadir University Faculty of Law. In the previous years, during our seminar series, we had the opportunity to examine different problems associated with climate crisis and its impact on law. First of all, I would like to give the floor to the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Law, Dr. Alara Efsun Yazıcıoğlu, for the opening speech. Thank you.
I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Faculty of Law to this online event of CCLLAB, Climate Change and Law Laboratory, which was established in our faculty last year, basically in 2021, in order to raise awareness about climate change and to carry out studies on this particular issue. As also indicated by Dr. Ünal, last year we had outstanding practitioners and academicians who contributed to our seminar series, Climate Change and Law. We are extremely glad and honored to have a prominent guest speaker today, Mr. Rogers, to initiate our academic year. I would like to welcome again everyone and our guest speaker, and I'm leaving the floor back to Dr. Ünal.
Thank you very much. Today we have a very special guest and a very interesting topic again. Today's lecture topic is climate security. How global warming leads to armed conflict and atrocity crimes. First of all, I would like to thank our speaker, Mr. Richard Rogers, for accepting our invitation. Before leaving the floor to Mr. Rogers, I would like to introduce you to our audience. Our speaker, Richard J. Rogers, worked as a barrister in London, an attorney in San Francisco, and a senior United Nations lawyer at several UN war crime tribunals. He was the senior legal officer at the Appeals Chamber of the UN Tribunal for Yugoslavia, principal defender at the Extraordinary Chamber in the Courts of Cambodia, and chief legal system monitor in Kosovo. Mr. Rogers has particularly expertise in the cross-section between international criminal law and mass environmental destruction, and testified this issue before the US Congress. He is the founding partner of Global Diligence LLP, an international legal advisory firm which practices in international crime and human rights, and executive director of Climate Council, a non-profit that pursues environmental justice through international criminal law. Mr. Rogers is on the advisory board of the Stop Ecocide campaign and the trustee of Sophia Point Rainforest Research Center. He has lived and worked in Africa, Asia, America, and Europe. Also, he was the deputy co-chair of the independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide. Now, the floor is yours, Mr. Rogers. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor, and thank you everyone for attending. I've been asked to talk about the issue of climate security. I'm going to first talk about the concept generally because it's not so well understood, and then I'll illustrate the concept through a couple of examples: the war in Sudan and the war in Syria. And I just wanted to pre-warn you that the subject is rather bleak and dark, particularly in the current context of the war in Ukraine. And I don't want to leave you all depressed at the end. So I will finish the talk with a few positive points. But bear in mind that climate security is really about risks. It's not some prediction of some inevitable future. So if we take care, of course, if we do what needs to be done, then we can have a cleaner and brighter future. But of course, it's better to understand the risks of global warming and climate change so that we're better placed to deal with them and manage those risks in the future. So what is climate security? Well, quite simply, it's the various global security risks that are induced either directly or indirectly by changes in climate pattern. The general idea is that global warming and climate change may exacerbate risks. So they may affect factors that are already endanger human security. So, for example, they may make situations of poverty worse, or they may create new situations. So, for example, food shortages caused by droughts. So, ultimately, climate change is seen as what they call a threat multiplier. So in terms of stability, this means that climate change can act as some sort of catalyst for violent conflict. And as we know, conflict can lead to mass crimes. And ultimately, all this increases the threat to international peace and security. Now, of course, not all global warming leads to violence in all situations. It clearly doesn't. And global warming is not always the single cause of violence in any given place. Most armed conflicts are driven by several interconnected factors, and we know what they are. They've been there for decades or centuries. There's issues of territorial conquest. There are issues of control of oil. There is ethnic hatred. There is upcoming elections. There is male ego. All those factors might come into play to drive a conflict. But climate change and global warming is now a recognized new driver. And not only is that a problem in itself, but then war, when it does kick off, it creates a vicious cycle. So just as global warming can lead to armed conflict, we often see that conflict drives the environmental crisis. So we may see a great deal of pollution of land or of water through bombs, through chemicals, through destruction of buildings, what have you. We see much more unregulated resource exploitation in areas that have been occupied by an enemy force. There might be extraction of resources to fund a war, like diamonds in Sierra Leone, or it might just be a matter of greed. We often see deforestation in areas that are occupied by an enemy force, and they take all the timber home. We may also see defoliage as an intentional act of war. And of course, the Agent Orange that was used by the US in Vietnam to defoliage the jungle so they could see the fighters is perhaps the most famous example, and caused absolute devastation to the natural environment. The truth is that in many conflicts, nature has become an intentional target in and of itself, sometimes to punish the enemy, sometimes to make rehabilitation harder, sometimes to destroy the cover so the opposing army can't hide. And too many armies throughout history have treated nature as an acceptable collateral damage. So even if it's not a direct target, it can become collateral damage despite the terrible effects on civilians. So that's the vicious cycle. Climate change and global warming can drive conflicts, can lead to mass atrocities, and then during the conflicts, we see further environmental destruction that makes rehabilitation more difficult. So let's look a little bit more closely about how global warming may increase the risk of war in practical terms. Well, there's several pathways from climate stress to conflict. Let's consider issues such as flooding, heat waves, food shortages or price shocks. All those are caused by the climate crisis. This can lead to, for example, a collapse of a pastoral society as they lose their fertile land. It can lead to mass forced displacement. It can put pressure on cities or other areas. And of course, all this in turn can lead to civil unrest, which leads to crackdowns, which can lead to the formation of rebel groups, or it could lead to the recruitment of disenfranchised people into terrorist groups who promise them something else apart from poverty. Ultimately, all this can end up in conflicts and therefore mass crimes. And so the general feeling about climate security is there's a recognition that the effects are not simple, are not necessarily direct, but rather they add to the complexity of threats, and they are threat multipliers, most worryingly in situations that are already precarious. So let's have a look at the sort of position or response of the international community to this issue of climate security. Well, as we know, traditionally, and perhaps for hundreds of years, maintaining international peace and security was really about protecting state borders or boundaries or territory from external military attacks from outside. Today that's evolved, and it's recognized that international peace and security must encompass economic, social, and environmental dimensions internally and externally. And this new broader approach is necessary if we're going to promote peace in the 21st century. So what does the UN have to say about the issue of climate security? Well, the UN Security Council, the main governing body, has recognized, firstly, the obvious, that international peace and security depends on a comprehensive engagement with the core drivers of conflict. That's pretty obvious, but it's also recognized more recently that such drivers include social, economic, and environmental factors. In fact, a UN Security Council draft, a draft resolution called the Adverse Impacts of Climate Change, in fact, it failed to get enough support for adoption, but the wording of that draft resolution is really interesting because it expresses climate security very effectively, and it shows that this is now very much on the radar of states and part of the agenda of maintaining peace. And I think it's worth quoting this draft resolution because it really does sum up the concept very well. So it says, acknowledging that the adverse effects of climate change, including erratic precipitation, increasing frequent and extreme weather phenomena, more frequent and severe tropical cyclones, floods and droughts, diminishing freshwater resources, desertification, land degradation, and sea level rises can lead to water scarcity, food insecurity, large-scale displacement, potentially leading to social tension and exacerbating, prolonging, or contributing to the risk of future conflicts and instability, and thereby posing a key risk to global peace, security, and stability. So a very, very good sum up of climate security. But of course, then we have the realpolitik, and despite broad support within the UN Security Council for this resolution, there was 12 out of 15 Security Council members supporting it. and also broad support in the UN General Assembly, where 113 UN member states supported it. The resolution ultimately was vetoed by Russia. India voted against it, and China abstained. So it didn't become a resolution, unfortunately. The ambassador in Niger, who was one of the key drivers and lead sponsors of the resolution, made the obvious and crucial point, and he said, the force of the Russian veto can block the approval of the text, but it cannot hide our reality. This reality can be demonstrated by looking at a few contemporary examples of conflicts across the globe. So let's now turn to the wars in Sudan and Syria, and have a look at how and to what extent global warming has played a role. Now, these are two very different conflicts in two very different regions, but both are closely linked to climate instability and environmental destruction. So let's have a look at Darfur in Sudan. In 2007, the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon at the time, called the war in Darfur the world's first climate change conflict. And he said it began as an ecological crisis arising, at least in part, from climate change. Now, ultimately, the ethnic cleansing of Darfur's Black African minorities by ethnic Arabs was the culmination of many years of growing tension. It ultimately turned violent for reasons that I will explain, and ended in genocide and displacement of 2.5 million people. So Darfur is perhaps the most obvious example of how global warming multiplied the security risks and ultimately initiated a conflict. So let's have a look to see how that happened. Well, Sudan is in the Sahel region, which is basically the barrier between the Sahara in the north and the tropical savanna in the south. Now, nomadic livestock herding has long been traditional amongst nomadic Arab tribes. And at the same time, there's many ethnic African tribes that have practiced a more sedentary agriculture. So there's really those two sort of social groups, and within those, there's many tribes as well. But unfortunately, the Sahel region has seen perhaps the most dramatic transformation of the natural environment anywhere in the world over the last few decades. The lack of rain, the increase in temperatures has led to an increase in desertification, basically transforming many hundreds of kilometers of what was grassland that could be grazed into desert. Between 1967 and 2007, the total annual rainfall fell by 30%, and the Sahara expanded a mile per year. Droughts, flash floods, extreme heat added to the loss of arable land. And so you can imagine there was a real squeeze on available fertile land, both for pastoralists and for sedentary farmers. And so because of this squeeze on available land, suddenly, having lived largely in peace and in parallel for hundreds of years, maybe thousands, the sedentary groups and the nomadic pastoralists came into contact with each other like never before, because they moved into new areas to find fertile land. And the sedentary farmers already felt vulnerable because of droughts. The Arab pastoralists already felt vulnerable because they had to keep moving. And this led to a competition over land. That competition is what led to the initial tensions. Eventually, it led to conflict between the nomadic and the sedentary communities. Now, Of course, this is where the reality of many interconnected factors comes into play, because in all likelihood, those relatively minor clashes may well have remained localized if it were not for the Sudanese government, who took advantage of the insecurity and the conflicts, the minor conflicts, to fund the Arab Janjaweed militia. And they started targeting civilians in 2003, as did the Sudanese government. And basically from that point on, there was a policy of ethnic cleansing in Darfur to cleanse the minority African agriculturalists. Ultimately, it ended in horrible mass crimes, and now the International Criminal Court in The Hague is investigating a case of genocide. So that's one scenario. The next one I'd like to look at is Syria. Now, I'm sure many of you know a lot more about this conflict than I do, but I've looked into it in terms of climate issues. So basically, beginning in 2011, the Syrian civil war claimed, as we all know, thousands and thousands of lives, and it continues to smolder to this day with the government and the opposition forces still at each other's throats. But when we look at the root causes of the conflict, when we look back at how it started, environmental issues were major drivers of the instability pre-war in Syria. So while climate change did not directly spark the civil war, it certainly helped to disrupt rural communities and massively amplify political tensions. So before the Arab Spring in 2011, Syria, it already was experiencing these terrible wealth disparities, some very rich and many very poor people. And then President Assad liberalized the economy in ways that clearly benefited people who were close to him, basically the rich urbanites. Now, he cut subsidies for food, for fuel, for water, and this really harmed both poor urban people, but even more so the poor rural farmers. It increased food prices, it sparked protests on the street. And the context here is very important because that economic policy followed what was already a devastating drought in Syria. So from 2006 to 2010, there was a real sharp decrease in rainfall and increase in temperatures. And again, this caused significant desertification of arable land. In many areas, the agriculture was completely decimated. In some places, 85% of livestock died. Crop yields decreased by 67%. Syria had to start importing grain and prices doubled. And ultimately, about 800,000 people lost their means of income, and all that caused significant poverty in rural areas. So what happened next? Well, of course, because of this agricultural crisis in the countryside, 1.5 million rural workers with no means of obtaining income, they migrated to the cities. But what they found there, instead of finding jobs and welcoming arms, they found unemployment, they found discrimination, they found poor infrastructure. All this led to further tensions, unrest, and ultimately it sparked a civil war. So in that sense, climate change was one of the driving factors of the political unrest. Now, of course, there were other factors. It's very complex, but there's no doubt that was one of them. And of course, we get back into that vicious cycle because during the war, there was a great deal of additional environmental destruction. So armed groups on both sides used water as a weapon of war. ISIS and the Syrian government, they both cut off cities from water. In 2019 alone, there were 46 direct attacks on water facilities. Some of them included intentional contamination of water resources. Of course, on top of that, we have the usual problems, the shelling of industrial sites, contamination of groundwater, more loss of agricultural land. And if that's not bad enough, in Syria, we also had the use of chemical weapons, which multiplies the problem. So that's another example of how global warming can help initiate conflict, build up tension, and then how once a war starts, how that again starts to affect and undermine the local environment. So that's the problem. So what should our international justice mechanisms be doing about this? Well, I think with the recognition that climate change is a threat to global peace and security, the question arises, what role can the International Criminal Court play? We know that the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, is the only permanent court, and it has the broadest mandate of any criminal court on earth, and it has the mandate to deal with atrocity crimes. Now, let's remember that a key foundational principle of the United Nations is to maintain international peace and security. That was one of the main reasons it was set up after the Second World War. And it also has a mandate to take effective measures to prevent and to remove threats. Now, the International Criminal Court is not an organ of the UN, it's not an organ of the UN Security Council, but they're very closely tied together. In fact, the UN Security Council can refer cases to the ICC. That's within the Rome Statute that created the court. Can the ICC help? Can it help the UN Security Council to maintain peace and security, to help prevent these issues through its criminal prosecutions? Yes, it can, absolutely. And it can do this partly by incorporating the issue of climate security within its work. The preamble of the Rome Statute that created the ICC recognizes that international crimes threaten peace, security, and the well-being of the world. And we know, of course, now that climate change can lead to war, wars lead to atrocities. So it seems obvious, actually, that the ICC should start to factor in climate security into its work. In fact, when you look at the ICC's current caseload, so those cases in preliminary examination or full investigation or trial, to varying degrees, issues of climate security are a cause, feature, or effect of most cases that it's considering. And we did an analysis of this within my NGO, Climate Counsel, and we found that approximately 70 to 90% of the ICC's pending cases intersect in one form or another with issues of climate security. So almost all cases. So concretely, what can the ICC do that will be helpful in tackling this issue? Well, firstly, it could start by publicly recognizing the role of climate security, of climate change, of global warming in conflict, and therefore in atrocity crimes. It could dedicate more resources to investigating this particular aspect within its cases. To what extent was climate change a driving force? How did that happen? Why did it happen? When did it happen? Et cetera, et cetera. And more specifically, with that information, in each relevant case, the prosecution could submit evidence to the court demonstrating how climate security is relevant to the context, of the crimes and to the gravity of the crimes being prosecuted. And that submission of evidence would allow the judges to include this issue in their judgments. And ultimately, all this would add to the body of evidence and the understanding of climate security. That in turn, when we move outside the walls of the International Criminal Court, should help add to the sense of urgency in the fight against global warming, which of course is key to a success of getting to carbon neutrality. So that shouldn't be asking too much of the ICC, because ultimately the underlying context is key to understanding international crimes and prosecuting them properly. So they should be doing it anyway. Has the ICC actually done anything so far on climate security or even environmental destruction? Sadly, no, it hasn't done anything. My NGO, Climate Counsel, will file a communication to the International Criminal Court on this issue of climate security. We're drafting that now. We will urge the prosecution to take some of the action that I described above, having pointed out how climate security is so relevant, so integral to its work. But ultimately, whatever the UN Security Council and the ICC think or do, climate security will continue to shape the future of conflict, and we ignore it at our peril. So that's all the issue of climate security, with a couple of examples to illustrate the point, and then with some talk about what the International Criminal Court do and could do and should do. Now, all that, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a little bit bleak. I think there's a lot of stress around because of all the terrible news. So I'm just going to end with some positive points, because there are a lot of positive points on climate change, and I don't want you all to go home depressed having listened to me. So you know, while climate security does pose some great challenges, there is cause for optimism, because ultimately climate security flows from global warming. So really, we've just got to tackle global warming and the biodiversity crisis. And there is a lot of positive moves there. I mean, certainly when you compare the situation to just 5 years ago. Today we have 70 countries, more than 70 countries actually, that have net zero targets. These cover 76% of global emissions, and they include the biggest polluters. So they include the US, China, European Union, etc. There's over 1,200 companies, many of them huge companies that are aiming for net zero. There are hundreds of financial institutions that are rejecting investments in fossil fuels. In the US, just several months ago, Biden managed to pass the largest climate spending package in US history, and China recently committed to hit net zero by 2060 and will spend trillions of dollars on green energy investments. And finally, in June this year, more than 100 countries committed to protecting at least 30% of the Earth's land and water by 2030. So there is now finally, belatedly, but still crucially, a concerted effort to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. So while climate security issues that I described will continue to be a significant challenge for the rest of our lives, they're not going to go away. They can be mitigated with further efforts. They can be managed to some extent, and the more we know about them, the more we can prepare for them. Thank you very much for listening, and of course I'm here to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you. We can have the questions now.
Yes, Abanus has a question.
Yes, please. Okay, now the questions are coming from the chat box. I'm going to...
If you want, I can ask it by speaking, but I also wrote it to the chat. So maybe it would be better for me to, send the questions directly to Mr. Richard Rogers, because I'm not allowed to send these messages to everyone in the chat. Yeah.
Would you like me to read it, or would you like to send it directly to Mr. Rogers?
Yeah, okay, that works for me.
Okay.
If it needs further explanation, I can also speak again.
Okay, so let me read it to Mr. Rogers. Here we have two questions. The first one is, how do you evaluate the role of international legal instruments, for example, the Paris Agreement, and alliances, for example, Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, to avoid or manage the climate security risks? Do they directly address climate security? So this is the first question. The second question is, how do you evaluate the role of civil society campaigns, initiatives, for example, fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, to put pressure on the policymakers to deal with climate security risks? Do you see any significant and direct initiative by civil society about these risks?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, I think the point is this, that the issue of climate security has not been at the forefront of the discussions on climate issues at the Paris Agreement or at COPs generally. There's been a real focus on, obviously the point is to reduce emissions, to avoid catastrophic global warming, to aim for neutrality. But the reasons given tend to be other problems, other concerns: rising sea levels, people having to move from their homes, failing agriculture, people suffering from extreme weather. There's been less talk about actually the end result of some of those problems, which can be conflict. And I think it would be useful if there was more talk about this connection, because conflict and atrocity crimes resonate very strongly with people. Everyone knows how awful they are. I mean, droughts are awful, floods are awful, but atrocities are something that resonates more strongly, that's more poignant. So I think if there's more talk about how climate change may drive armed conflict, may ultimately lead to mass atrocities, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, then that will provide added impetus to the fight against climate change. And that's kind of the point that people in this area are making, that we need to understand how bad it can get. It's not just about migration, it's not just about failing crops, it's not just about displacement, it's also about mass murder. So I think there needs to be more talk.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think I think someone is writing right now. They are going to direct me the question. Yes, we are waiting for the question. Yes, any questions? Okay. Mrs. Fatma Betül Shehrawala is writing right now 2 questions. I'm going to read them for you. Hello, thanks for this opportunity to gather valuable information about climate change and its effect on the social structures. She has 2 questions. Now she's writing. In the meantime, if anyone has questions, please feel free to write here. Yes, the first question. Are there any sanctions that can be applied to the states WHO access the threshold of the carbon dioxide emissions that they have committed in several summits? Sorry, states who? I'm sorry. I'm repeating the question. Are there any sanctions that can be applied to the states which excess the threshold of the carbon dioxide emissions that they have committed in several summits? This is the question.
No, there's not. The agreements, the Paris agreements, rely on voluntary commitments, and there is no sanction for states to breach their own commitments, or at least there's no criminal sanction, there's no civil sanction, there is a sort of public sanction in the sense that there can be a criticism. So there's political sanctions, but no actual fines or anything that can be done. The system relies on peer pressure ultimately. The feeling was that if you make it mandatory, then you'll lose states. They won't agree to sign up to something if they think they're going to end up paying a fine if they don't meet their commitments. So it's a system that relies on states being responsible, on states understanding that this is in their interest. It relies on peer pressure. So China and America will compete on who's going to lead the world in global warming, commitments, reductions, technology, solutions. The European Union, of course, wants to see itself as out in the front. But there's no sanction. But you see, it's interesting when you look at what happened in Australia, where the former government, until the change about 6 months ago, the former government was terrible on global warming issues, which was bizarre because Australia can really suffer from global warming. But yet the government did almost nothing. It had very pathetic commitments of reduction. And ultimately, this frustrated the people of Australia, and they voted that government out. And one of the major issues, actually, in the election was climate and how to deal with climate issues. And Australia, even though it's a relatively small population, it has an outsized effect on the environment for various reasons. It has a lot of coal, etc. And so ultimately, because Australia was lagging so far behind in terms of taking responsibility, that government was voted out, and the new government have said that they are now joining the leading pack of countries who want to do the responsible thing. So there's no sanctions, but there is a lot of political pressure.
Mm-hmm. And her second question is that, do water wars have possibility to be occurred between states in near future?
Absolutely. Water scarcity will be a problem, an increasing problem as temperatures rise, as rainfall decreases. And there will be situations where states will start using water for their own populations, for their own agriculture, for drinking water, etc., and thereby deny the possibility to neighboring states because they're further upstream, for example. And I think that's really one of the concerns. That's one of the resources amongst many. That's one of the key resources that we're concerned about is water.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question. Why soft law techniques are preferred in the management of climate change policies, and how will be implementation process and sanctions? Yes.
Well, I think so far there's been a preference to use soft law or just political persuasion in these issues because they're so complex, because what we're doing is we're transforming the nature of an economy. So things that were lawful and encouraged, like drilling for oil, like using coal, they are now the new evils. But they weren't. You know, what's evil tomorrow wasn't necessarily evil yesterday. And so we have to. It's important to give time for this transition. We can't sort of go in with a sledgehammer and say, you know, everyone that's digging up coal is some kind of criminals, should be put in prison. It won't work like that. We'll lose the support of industry, and we need industry on board. We need industry. We need them to act much more responsibly than they are, but we're not going to get that by threatening hard law criminal sanctions before people have had a chance to transform. Now, having said that, I'm a big proponent of some hard law options in extreme circumstances. So the law of ecocide is one of those options. Now, ecocide is not yet an international crime, and there's a big movement to make it an international crime. And the point of that is that it would deal with the very worst examples of environmental destruction. And we need a crime of ecocide, an international crime of ecocide, because the current international crimes that we have, they cannot deal with situations where there is just destruction of the environment without human harm that goes along with it. All the crimes that we have at the moment, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, require human suffering. They're designed to protect humans. We need a new crime that is designed to protect the environment in and of itself, irrespective of human harm. And ecocide can play that role. But it's important that ecocide focuses on the very worst examples of environmental destruction, where there was an intention, or at least a knowledge that that destruction would likely occur from actions, where you know, situations where there wasn't really a social or economic advantage in doing the act. And in those circumstances, those particular circumstances, I think we very much should be looking to hard law. So I would encourage all of you to sort of get behind the campaign to make ecocide a fifth crime at the ICC. And that will really help to focus minds, to change behavior, and to make businesses much more cautious about their operations and the effect on the natural environment.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions? Right now, I see no questions in the chat box or yes, okay. Thank you so much for this excellent seminar, and I also thank our audience for their questions. Now we come to the end of our seminar. Before closing, I would like to give you the floor for your closing words, Mr. Rogers.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I guess I'd just say on closing that there I think what's important is for as many people as possible to become activists in one form or another to try to deal with this climate crisis. And it's far better that they are energized, happy, positive, optimistic activists rather than kind of, worried and depressed activists. Enthusiasm, determination is what will get us out of this crisis and what will lead to a healthier and brighter future for everyone. So that's just my closing point. Climate security is a real worry. The biodiversity crisis is a massive concern. But we have the ability to deal with it all. Ultimately, it's all about politics, and ultimately, politics will be swayed and moved by the people on the ground. And we've seen that evidenced very much in the last 5 years. So I would encourage you all to become very active in whatever form you think is most appropriate in dealing with this crisis, and that can start with supporting the campaign to make ecocide a fifth crime at the ICC. Thank you very much.
Indeed, thank you so much for your comments. We would love to keep in touch with you, and I hope everyone benefited from today's lecture. And now I say goodbye and thank you for this seminar, and I wish you a great day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers.